Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Drawing School's Creative Conversation series. Tonight, we're looking forward to a conversation exploring the work of the artist Paul Dash, and he'll be in conversation with Habda Rashid, Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at Kettle's Yard and the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. I hope that some of you will have seen the really wonderful recent exhibition at Kettle's Yard, Paint Like the Swallow Sings Calypso, which featured works by Paul Dash in dialogue with historical works such as manuscripts, prints, paintings, all reflecting on the themes and history of Carnival. And this exhibition, which was curated by Habda, is going to be one of the starting points for conversation this evening. So welcome to you both, and I'll just give you a little bit more introduction. So Paul Dash was born in Barbados and came to the UK aged 11. He went on to study at Chelsea School of Art, and he also taught at London University, achieving an MA and then a PhD, all while continuing to paint. And in recent years, he's been a participating artist in the Tate exhibition, Life Between Islands, from which his self-portrait and talking music were purchased. And he's also shown at many galleries, including the Moore Galleries, the Whitechapel, Barbados Museum, and the Guildhall Galleries. So he'll be in conversation with Habda Rashid, who, as I mentioned, works across the Fitzwilliam and Kettle's Yard, and she oversees the acquisition of works that broaden representation, as well as shaping and delivering collections-based displays, research, public programming, and curatorial work on 20th century and 21st century British art within a global context. Habda was previously senior curator at Create London and then interim artistic director. And she's also been part of the curatorial department at the Whitechapel Gallery. So welcome to you both. Thanks so much for joining us and being part of this series.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. So Paul and I, we've been in discussion we were just talking earlier, and we've actually been kind of in a conversation for over a year now. We started planning the exhibition at Kettle's Yard around February 2022, and we met quite intensely every 2 weeks with John Lyons and Errol Lloyd to choose works from the Fitzwilliam and Kettle's Yard collection. So we've had this kind of ongoing conversation. And the exhibition itself was the bringing together of the first time, which is quite bizarre, of the works from Fitzwilliam and Kettle's Yard, but they were placed in dialogue with works from Paul, John and Errol. The kind of theme of the exhibition was around Carnival, but that theme really acted as a kind of allegory for kind of life and art in general. And the title of the exhibition is a kind of slightly rewritten quote from Errol Lloyd and references a swallow quite poetically, Paint Like the Swallow Sings Calypso, but also Calypso, the kind of political intent of Calypso music. So the show itself had this kind of deep relationship to art, but also a kind of rootedness to the kind of colonial beginnings of Carnival. But I want to kind of go one step back and start when I first met Paul, which was at a studio visit, and we were chatting away about a couple of current paintings that Paul was making at that time, large scale paintings, and we kind of sat down. And quite kind of surreptitiously, Paul pulled out these two smaller paintings, which were hidden behind other kind of canvases. And they were beautiful, and they've stuck with me. And these paintings, he said, I made them when I was 14 or 15 in Oxford when I was, and they're kind of imagined scenes of Barbados. And they had this amazing slippage between figuration and abstraction. And a lot of the content, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, were imagined compositions. So your grandmother's house. So I think perhaps, and in relationship to this image which is on the screen, I think, Paul, perhaps you could start with your kind of formative years and what role art played in your life.
Yes, thanks to you, of course, for making the exhibition at Kettle's Yard possible and for involving me in it, and for all at the Royal Drawing School for making this evening possible. Yes, my life in art started at about the age of 13 or 14 at school. I was brought up in, rather, my parents lived in Oxford, and they brought us over from the Caribbean in 1957 to join them. And I was put into this school in Oxford on the Coley Road that I didn't enjoy very much at all. And I didn't really like the teaching or the standard of educational content or the appropriateness of educational content or anything about the school, except for cricket. And, I enjoyed playing cricket. I'm a Barbadian, for Christ's sakes. And I did well at that. I ended up playing cricket for Oxfordshire schoolboys before I left the school. And at the age of 13, 14, I discovered that people were making a lot of noise about my artwork. Now, I didn't know that if I had talent. I didn't think about it as talent. I was just doing the lesson, and or the lessons. But there's a lot of noise and people took an interest, and I began to take it more seriously. I take myself more seriously as a painter, and I painted scenes from Oxford because the head of art, the art teacher, there's only one art teacher, allowed us to do what we wished, believe it or not. Things weren't structured in the way that they're expected to be structured nowadays, taken through programs of learning. We could just do what we wanted. So I painted pictures of Oxford city centre, where I visited every Saturday morning with my mum when we went shopping together on a double-decker bus. She on the lower deck, I went to the top deck. And so I got these views of Oxford as we travelled, certainly the Cowley Road, then, the high road in Oxford. I got these views of the masses of people shopping and, the students with their long scarves and their capes and so on. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And back in school, I made paintings based on those scenes, the milling crowds and masses of people in Oxford, as well as the buildings in the medieval buildings that formed the backdrop to everything. So that was my experience, really, traveling into Oxford with my mum on Saturday mornings and using those visits as a starting point for making artwork in the classroom.
But then at home, you were making some other types of work, some other types of painting. And I'm, quite interested in the kind of dissonance between the difference between what you were doing in school and the kind of the first painting, which was in this presentation, was something you were doing at home. Your mother would buy you paints, wouldn't she? And you would spend time. And that was when the imagined Barbados started, which you still see traces of in your work today.
Yeah. That painting that you saw a few moments ago was the very first oil painting I ever made. And it was on a card, and I've still got it to this day. By a miracle, it survived my travels and staying in digs and all sorts of stuff. And it survived Chelsea Art College too. But my experience at school was one thing. My experience at home was something quite different. I really didn't want to paint pictures of Oxford at home. And my painting at home started incidentally because my mum realized, she saw me coming home making drawings on the back of Christmas cards. I didn't have a sketchbook. I didn't take my artwork home from school. And I didn't really talk to her about what I did in school because I hated the school so much. But, you know, this subject was something I really enjoyed. And she saw me making drawings on the back of postcards, Christmas cards. And so she bought me some drawing books, sketchbooks. My mum had no knowledge of art whatsoever. And I was stunned that she knew where to go and buy books like that from. And then a few weeks later, she bought me some watercolor sets, a watercolor set, and squirrel hair brushes, which were very good, but you know, they were good enough to start painting with. And then the painting that we were looking at was painted in oils. That was my very first oil painting ever. She bought the oils. I was stunned when she came through the door with some oil paints in her hands. And then a couple of weeks later, she bought brushes, all from her meager housekeeping money. But unfortunately, I didn't know how to use oils. I just knew how to use, you know, powder paint that we had in school. But I at the age of 14, I won a school prize for art. And they gave me two very thin how to do it books. One of them was on oil painting and how to prepare canvas. And I realized then that I needed something called rabbit skin glue to prepare to seal the canvas or card with. But I didn't have rabbit skin glue. I certainly wasn't going to ask my mum to go and buy me rabbit skin glue. She'd done more than enough. So I used Cloy that I used for sticking bits of paper together. It had, you know, it's meant to be some kind of glue. So I thought that would suffice. And so I covered the card in Cloy, and when it dried, I painted on it. And that was the picture you saw there just now. My first oil painting, and my mum's paints and my mum's hawk hair brushes.
And then I suppose, you know, do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of historical painters? I mean, we spent a long time looking at the Fitzwilliam and Kettle collection, choosing work. So do you want to talk about in those early years, and because you eventually did go to art college, about how different European artists influenced your practice?
Yes, well, I'm from a working class background. We didn't have books in our home. Certainly, I wasn't bought any. I was bought one book in my childhood, and that was a book on choral that my eldest brother bought for me.
Yeah,
and I've got that book to this day. But I didn't have books to turn to for ideas on paintings and painting styles and such like. But eventually, in my 15th year, I made these friends who pointed me in the direction of the Renaissance artists, Michelangelo and Raphael and people like that. And I had a friend called Derek Goodridge who lived not too far away. And I went to his home, and he showed me these incredible books. And so I started to copy. Thanks to him, I started copying images, paintings, and drawings from books on Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, blah, blah, blah. And Fra Angelico before, people like that. And then over time, I became acquainted with the Impressionists. But I really cut my teeth, so to speak, on the Renaissance artist. And, you know, the classical drawing, things like this. And that has stayed with me all the way through my career as an artist, even though Impressionism had a massive impact on my use of color. And, you know, and their lifestyle, everything about the Impressionists I like. But the background to it all was the Renaissance, the period of the Renaissance.
I have a couple of questions from that. A kind of quick question is, you know, and quite an interesting question for the context in which we're speaking is, perhaps you can say a little bit about the distinction, or whether there is a distinction in your practice between drawing and painting, and how you kind of move quite fluidly, I think, between the two? And another question is a little bit more about the show, but I'll kind of come on to that after you answer, talk about the kind of relationship between painting and drawing in your work.
Yeah. The two of them are totally intertwined as far as I'm concerned. I don't make preparatory drawings for anything. And you'll see some paintings in a few moments that are crowded with people, dancers in the streets and so on. None of those figures were copied or made, I don't know, from sketchbooks and such like. I just don't get on with making preparatory drawings. I see myself as a sort of jazz musician painter, who improvises. And that's the reason why I developed this crosshatch approach to making drawings. The crosshatch figures aren't bounded by borders, by outlines. You feel that they're in a state of flux. They're constantly moving or about to move, not just in the space where they're positioned, but in terms of the technique, you feel that because there's no firm outline to the figures, that they could be developed in any direction at any moment. And I like that. I like that very much indeed. And later, in fact, I added to that feeling of movement and potential for movement by actually collaging over the drawings, so I could actually take them in other directions again. So I like that freedom. So I never make preparatory drawings. My paintings and drawings are constantly in a state of flux. And as a result of that, the paintings take ages to make. And the drawings, the crosshatch drawings take ages to make because I don't have something to refer back to by way of a preparatory work or preparatory works. Everything is happening as I work. Everything's in the process of making. So you might say I've made a rod for my back, but that's the way it is. Maybe it's an African thing. This idea of improvisation and developing things as you work. But that's the way it is with me, and that's the way I like working.
And then, so perhaps in this instance, I'd like to kind of, if okay, Paul, let's kind of talk through your technique a little bit more. And Rosie, if you scroll through, so like another question, again, it's quite a kind of straightforward question, is just, as well, there's a kind of tonality to your work. Some of the drawings are very sepia, monochrome. If you look at your paintings, there's a kind of ageness to it. And so I just wanted to ask you about what is the kind of thought process that you go through when you're thinking of colour or when you're thinking of monochrome, and if there is a thought process.
Well, that's a $1 million question. I think you know.
You're an artist. Tell it all.
Well, when I'm sat in front of a canvas or a board, whatever I'm working on, trying to determine which direction the work is going to go, it's like a game of chess. Because as I said earlier, I don't want to keep repeating myself. I don't work from preparatory things. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the painting, and it's a sort of dialogue. We're constantly in conversation. And sometimes I'm mumbling to myself, in fact, because, I put some marks in, I put some blocks of paint into work, and I sit and think about it. How do these work together? How do they relate to each other? What do I need to do to get them to work better? And then, gradually changes are made as a result of that sort of, constant review of the work. And in terms of tonality and such like, I don't intend from the outset very often to move towards blues or browns or what have you. They just emerge in the process of making as a result of colors coming together and having this conversation, if you like, across the surface of the painting. And that's what's exciting to me, because I don't know what I'm going to end up with. It's like rambling. You're going on a ramble. You wait to see what's going to happen to you. And as I say to, you know, later, it's like Jackson Pollock. I look at Jackson Pollock's paintings and I absolutely love his work. And as I said, in other contexts, he's the ultimate carnival painter, I feel like, because of the way he layers things on, and then he has to respond to those things that he's put on the painting. And I like that sort of approach. So to go back to your question about tonality and so on, I don't really. Obviously, this self-portrait here was painting in difficult circumstances. When my wife and I lived in a flat in North London, and I didn't have a studio. I was teaching part-time, but painting in our flat. And eventually she threw me out of it and said, I can't stand the smell of turf. So that's another story, but...
But you're working all the time, Paul. You're so prolific. And you've also you have a few works. Do you not have a few works on the go at the same time? And don't you, I mean, there was one work in the exhibition, a drawing, and it had a stuck on, as you've mentioned, stuck on piece of paper. So you also, so is that when you've made a mistake to cover something, or what? But it creates a kind of materiality to your work.
Sometimes there are areas in my crosshatch drawings that are overworked.
Right.
I'm perfectly happy to stick a bit of paper over it and rebuild that area to make it fresher. But the float drawing, which you'll see later, is one that is covered in paper. Bits of paper collaged onto the surface, very carefully cut out with a scalpel, so that they fit together almost perfectly. And that wasn't about mistakes being covered up. I was pushing my technique of work and improvising as far as I could, and almost welcoming opportunities for actually sticking bits of paper on, so as to create this kind of materiality on the surface. They're not, if you think that the thing is covered in, that a bit of paper were collaged onto the surface to cover over mistakes, then the whole thing must be a mistake. And it wasn't, it would lose its freshness if that was the case. No, it was created in that way. And I think it's one of my most successful pieces of work. But I must say, it knocked the stuffing out of me, because I had to be so precise. And it took a long time to make. I mean,
how long did it take to make?
Well, I can't tell you in hours or days, but it went on and on and on. And I mean, over many weeks, and sometimes I just put it aside and work on something else and come back to it again and so on. I mean, that's the way I work. I work on several pieces, as you indicated earlier. I work on several pieces, because when you're sitting staring at a piece of work, as I have to, because I don't have drawings to work from, I'm making it up as I go along. As you become overwhelmed and your vision becomes blurred with it, you just have to put it aside. And so I would set a painting aside for weeks sometimes, if not even months. And then sometimes I'll go to my studio not knowing what I'm going to work on. And I hear the painting or the drawing calling me. And that's when I know, it's time to go back to it.
Rosie, can we run through the slideshow? I'd like to get to one of the crosshatch drawings. So
these earlier drawings, I meant to demonstrate that I enjoyed working.
Yeah, so if we keep running through, I'll tell you which one's a good one, because I just want if you go back one, Rosie.
These crosshatch drawings, the first one, if you can go back to the first brown one. Next one, that one, that was the very, very first one I made in 2013. When we went through a cold snap. It was absolutely freezing in the studios, and I'm sure that many people will sympathize, because that's the lot of the artists in the winter, I'm afraid. It was freezing, and so I just thought, I'm not staying in the studio. My fingers going numb, and so I went home, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anything started there. But I had a sketchbook. So I got a sketchbook out and I made this drawing. I sat there and fiddled around with inks and pen and ink. And I just followed the nib. I don't know where the nib was taking me, but it took me on this journey across the paper. And I thought, what the heck is this? But I liked it. I liked it. And I made several after that. I think go on to the next one, just to demonstrate how, I started experimenting with line in different ways just to see where they'll take me. And there are many, many others of that ilk. And I can go through to the next one. And so after 2 weeks at home, I went back to the studio because the weather had got warmer. And I was determined to try making a big drawing based on the idea, the principle of crosshatch that I was developing in the sketchbook at home in this way. And the next piece actually should be that's the very, very first drawing that I made on a large scale that was inspired by the work from the sketchbook. So all that absolutely crosshatch. And it was just pouring out of me. And I thought, wow, I really enjoy doing it. And it's based incidentally on the Samba Drome in Rio, because I'd gone to Rio with my wife to see the Carnival. And that came out of it.
I mean, it's good that we've stopped here because, and we can use this as an example, but we can also possibly go through and look at other drawings, because another, and again, it's interesting being stood and confronted by your work as a viewer, because what's noticeable is your perspective. With this one, it's a kind of over the top. But with others, it shifts around the plane. And so what's quite fascinating is, for me, and I think compelling about your work, is actually there is more and more to discover. So on the surface, it looks like, a kind of amalgamation of line, but actually it's kind of broken down into individuals, so each figure is doing something different, and then sections of perspective so you make those drawings where the front row is actually directly one-to-one with the viewer, and then it kind of moves around the plane so that each section is slightly different. And I think it then, so you've got these kind of different levels that are activated at different moments of a viewer looking at your work. Do you, when you make your work, do you move around? Or do you just kind of work straight on it, like make a mark, make another mark, make another mark? How do you compose?
You have constantly to be stepping back from it. And in fact, I've invested in a drawing desk, or drawing easel, some would call it, that enabling me to actually have a better view of what I'm doing. Now, you're constantly stepping back, pinning the work up, stepping back, looking at it from different perspectives. And the perspective side of it that you made reference to, it goes back to my love of the Renaissance. Bruegel and people like that. I mean, Bruegel's, we were looking at him, and it just blew my mind when I was showing at a Kettle jar. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Seeing that work and having my work in the same space was one of the great and most thrilling experiences I've had in my life. And, the way he used perspective, the way he's looking over the top, these are things that were embedded in not just Bruegel, but other people as well, other Renaissance artists. And I mean, I love it, like this drawing here. It's based on the abduction of children in Nigeria that I was really appalled by a few years ago. So I made that drawing, they were taken at night and so on. There were Muslim kids. And I made this drawing, and it's incidentally the person in the pointed hat in the middle is referencing the Ku Klux Klan, because even though it's in Nigeria, it's the same sort of mentality as far as I'm concerned, sick mentality in relation to the way these people were working with children. But, that's the way that was done. And, as I said, the Renaissance and then other artists that came afterwards. And this one here,
yeah, so this is a really good example of the shift in perspective, isn't it?
Yes. Sometimes it's like they're looking at the viewer, looking at the subjects from street level, and looking at them from a perspective, perspective. And that is intentional because I want to show the best of the figures, get the best views of the figures, either from that view or from street level view. And I think that makes it more interesting. And I always, in fact, usually almost always in my paintings and drawings, I always place the figures at the bottom of the work. I position them as if they're actually seen straight on at street level, but the others above them are seen in a more oblique view, as if seen from above. So it's a mixture of things going on. But that is always, you're inviting people to take a journey through your work. You want to be surprising them and challenging them at every touch and turn. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. It's my way of making that sort of challenge possible.
Rosie, can we have a look at the Bruegel? Can we move through the show? So if we go back to the Bruegel, we can kind of enhance. Oh, yeah. So this is quite a interesting story for me. When we started developing the exhibition, Paul, in exuberance for the Bruegel, really wanted it, but Paul, I don't know if you know this. I think I told you actually, I was so concerned that people would just clamor into the exhibition and just run straight to the Bruegel, ignoring everything else, that had this kind of secret campaign to keep it out. But because you were so excited about your work being placed in the context of this Bruegel, I allowed it in.
Oh.
But I mean, in the context of the exhibition, I mean, it's brilliant because it's working class. It's the working classes enjoying themselves, which was very rarely depicted. But do you want to say more about this work?
Absolutely. I totally agree with everything you've said about, the class situation. And whereas if you compare it to the Dewar print that was in the same space, which is about the upper classes, enjoying themselves and dancing and so on, parading and showing themselves off. This is it with all their finery, but this is, a village event, ordinary people expressing themselves in different ways, with different activities going on. And of course, I resonate with that. I'm a black person from the Caribbean with roots in the slave trade, or being in, having relations and forebears who were enslaved. And these are people that I relate to, irrespective of color, ordinary people enjoying themselves and giving expression to what they want to give expression to. And I thought that's magnificent. And the way Bruegel handles it, the perspective and the aerial view. And, if you look at the area at the very top of the street, where the figures are much smaller, and compare them to those at the front, they're smaller, but they're still active, they're still relevant. And he does that magically. And there's layers of activity going on. I think are absolutely fantastic. So wonderful. To me, he's one of the greatest artists of the last millennium, and one that maybe we need to celebrate even more.
Yeah. I mean, Rosie, if you just move on to the last slide. So this is just a kind of very small installation shot of the exhibition in Kettle's Yard. And what we did was we placed Paul's works in conversation and kind of almost in opposition. So on the one side of the room, you had etchings, prints, drawings, paintings that spanned probably the 15th century up to the early 20th century. And then on the other side of the room, you had Paul's mainly drawings and one painting. And Paul, the energy from Paul's work could really stand up against this kind of mass of art history, which was kind of including manuscripts opposite. So it wasn't intentionally oppositional. And you know, within the context of the historic work, there were scenes of Bacchanalia, medieval carnivals, commedia dell'arte, so the kind of celebrations and rituals which were the kind of starting point of Carnival. And then also opposite, so on the right of your screen, you have one of Paul's works, the stick-lick figures, and opposite the stick-lick figures, which is out of shot, was the European masquerade, was an image of a European masquerade balls, and it was those festivities which went to the Caribbean as part of colonialism and kind of became coalesced with indigenous and African traditions, and essentially the carnival we know today is a kind of amalgam of European, African and Meridian traditions. But we haven't got much time left, but I wondered whether, Paul, you could talk a little bit about stick-lick and more widely about, you kind of alluded to it about the Ku Klux Klan hats, but perhaps a little bit about your relationship to your history and how that is played out in your drawings. But maybe a little bit about stick-lick as well, because that was the most intentional work of yours, I think.
Yeah. Well, as a child, when I came to this country in 1957, and this is very important to me in my identity and my sense of history and my sense of who I am. When I came to this country in 1957, the age of 11, I was placed at that dreadful school. I had to make sense of what was going on around me. Very, very sadly, in my family, being the family they were very loving, very warm in many ways. And my mum was unbelievable, you know, in terms of what she did for me as an artist, apart from anything else, apart from loving me as her son. We didn't have conversations as a family. We didn't sit at a dinner table as many middle-class families would do today and converse on a daily basis or even once a week. People are eating at different times in different places. So we didn't sit and talk about things. And suddenly here I was, brought from Barbados, sent to a school I hated because the quality of teaching was so bad, and I was despised by my form teacher because I was black. Having to make sense of being surrounded by white people. When in Barbados, you saw the odd white person here and there, even though they had absolute power. But you didn't, you had a particular view of who white people were. And they were like gods. That's where they presented themselves. And suddenly, there in Oxford, there I was, surrounded by white kids, white teachers and everything, people in the street. Very, very few black people anywhere, because at that time, you could almost count the number of black people on your fingers of one hand that were in Oxford. And I was having to make sense of that by myself, because we weren't sitting at home and discussing it. There were never, ever any conversations about it. So you had to make sense of it in your own head, your own mind. That's why I started painting carnivals at home. I wanted to separate school from home. Home was a safe place, a place that reminded me of Barbados, really. We had meals where we used Caribbean vegetables, which you could get hold of even then, one or two of them anyway. And then outside of that, at home, even though home was a safe place, we had television. We watched television. And the fascism you saw on television, the way black people were being treated on television, no one prepared me for that. In Barbados, we didn't see stuff like that. Birth of a Nation, Littlest Rebel, Shirley Temple, and then, where the black servants are treated like dirt, and constantly you're getting all this stuff about black people being inferior. Even if it said, I remember the Dam Busters with Richard Todd, and he had a black dog that he called Nigger.
Indeed.
And, you know, and I had to make sense of all that. We weren't discussing it in our family. How do you expect a child of 11 to come to terms with stuff like that? So I tried to make sense of it through my art. But the thing that stayed in my head was the Ku Klux Klan. They petrified me, even though they were happening in the United States. You felt that white people anywhere. I mean, we knew what was going on in South Africa. You felt white people. We also were hearing stories about what's going on in Australia, where blacks were allowed to go there, as I understood it. You know, I mean, you just thought, you know, and that was the reason why in my work, I refused to use technologies that are invented or created and developed in the West. I want to have them in my work. I people my pictures with people usually, because there were people I felt were my safe place, but, you know, needed my representation. I didn't want to have Western technologies in my paintings. Even now, I don't like to have people walking around with, I don't like to have people in my...
Well, this work's quite interesting, isn't it? Because this work points to something, but isn't anything specific, is it?
No, it's referencing my ancestors or one's ancestors, not a specific group of ancestors. But the idea of African dress being on Black people in the Caribbean, that's what it's about, really. And then to say they're proud of who I am, that's part of my identity.
And it permeates your work, you know, and you know, it is red, it's there, you know, you feel it. And I suppose in a way it's worth talking because we've got a few seconds left, very briefly about CAM. So if I could just briefly introduce, so the Caribbean Artist Movement was...
I was a member of CAM. I was
the Caribbean Artist Movement set up in 1965 in London.
Yeah. And
it lasted about 7 years, didn't it?
That's right.
And it was the first time emigre from the Caribbean kind of met each other. Because, you know, you were in Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad, and, you know, everyone was in one place and could share experience. And it was a kind of broad movement. So it was literature, theatre and visual arts. So do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences of CAM?
Well, I was in awe of a member of the Caribbean Artist Movement, most of whom were literary people, you know, Andrew Salkey and Winston Harris. He actually asked me to illustrate one of his stories on Palace of the Peacock, which was published in Denmark. You know, Wilson Harris, Andrew Salkey, Kamau Brathwaite, who was then Edward Brathwaite. But Kamau Brathwaite, John LaRose himself, of course, wonderful people. And then Aubrey Williams, tremendous painter. Alcia McNeish, whom I'm showing with at the moment, actually.
At the Whitworth.
Whitworth. She was a dear friend. I mean, I loved her, and her husband, John Weiss, very articulate, very bright man. And I remember going to their home for meals, and he would speak, and he had this way of speaking, sort of everything's in paragraphs. I thought, my God, I wish I could do that. You know, they were very, very bright and able people, and Errol Lloyd, of course, and one of the foremost people in CAM. He was very young himself, a bit older than me, but very young. But he was so able, and you know, a very good writer himself, and he was a sculptor at the time. It was Ronald Moody.
Yeah,
I'm a trustee of Ronald Moody now, but you know, he was someone I loved and respected because of his dignity and the way he carried himself. Wonderful man. It was an incredible movement. But I was very young. I became, you know, they drafted me onto the committee because they're looking to the future. Unfortunately, it collapsed after a few years, but not because of me, but, you know.
They were possibly funded. But I have to, just because I'm conscious of time, and Paul, I'm so sorry because I could listen to you talk for forever, but we're seeing such beautiful works pass through this slideshow. You know, I mean, I've not seen this painting before, so I kind of wanted to kind of end on asking you about now, really, and like
Wow.
about now and what you're working on and what your thoughts are in terms of your practice. I mean, because you're having, I mean, not that we needed to, but, you know, you must have had a lot of interest post Kettle's Yard, and, you know, how have you settled back into your work?
Right. Well, you know, and I don't want to go on about it for a long time, but I had a serious illness that needed to be sorted out. And that's in the process of being dealt with. I mean, it's been dealt with in terms of an operation, but I'm coming through that now, hence my voice, as you know. So that took me away from my art for about two and a half months. And that was painful, being able to go to the studio, because I didn't have the strength, the physical strength to do it. And I also changed studios because I wanted to be closer to home, closer to my wife, because she's had an operation. We're both getting on anyway. We're both elderly. So I wanted to be close to Jean. So that there are two big things to play with. You know, my health. Jean had a full knee replacement, and there's my health, and then there's moving studios, and it was very difficult to keep, you know, all those balls in the air. But the new studio is just about 15 minutes walk from here, 10 to 15 minutes walk from here. And that's where I'm doing things. I was there for a little while today. And I'm painting. This thing is a piece that it's going to be, I have to say it's going to be, I don't know what I should say.
Oh, say, there's no one listening.
I was sworn to secrecy, but I'm not sure if I need to keep it secret any longer, but it's going to be shown at the Royal Academy.
Amazing. Is it in the summer exhibition?
I was invited to
amazing.
By David Renfrey. So I mean, that for me is an incredible honor in all sorts of ways. You know, to be showing at the Academy again, and I've been shown there a few times before, but you know, in these circumstances. So that's what I'm doing. I'm painting. I'm in my studio when I can be, and hopefully be in there a lot more in the near future, in a studio space that's quite interesting, and you will see it quite soon, I'm sure. And that is it. But I'm painting again, as you can see. I'm painting Carnival, crowded scenes, lots of people, Caribbean people. Very little technology. You don't see motorbikes or cars for the reasons I've given. And I even show buildings because I don't know where to locate the figures, because I don't know who I am anymore in terms of, I've got a Barbadian background, but I lived in Britain, but I can't claim Britain as my own because of my earlier years at school. But I can't claim Barbados. It's too far. You know, I left there about 60 years ago, 65 years ago. And I can't make a reference to that. So what do I make reference to? Well, I don't make reference to any background, any environment, just the people.
Amazing. I mean, the colors in this painting, I mean, and the movement, like the shift between abstraction and figuration, is still there in your work. If we go back to when you were 14, and the pieces you're working on, although, I mean, obviously developed and different, there's still that essence, there's still that slippage. And I think it kind of, what's so generous about your work, Paul, is it leaves that space then for the person looking at it to think. And I think that's what draws someone in.
Well, that's lovely of you to say that. And this is one of the most moving things that anyone has said to me for a long time. Thank you very much indeed.
You're right.
You're really a great friend.
And we can see Claudia.
Hi, thank you both so much. Such an absorbing conversation, and really wonderful to thank you, Paul, for sharing so many insights on your practice and your process, and so many wonderful images. We've got a few minutes for questions. If anyone in the audience would like to ask Paul or Habda any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A box or the chat box. We've got a few minutes for those. So yeah, I just perhaps just to start, I was really struck by this sort of description you gave, Paul, of yourself as a jazz musician painter, and that the way you talked about your kind of the improvisory nature of your process. and that sense of kind of movement and dynamism is so striking in so many of your works, so mesmerizing, really. But I was thinking also about how you evoke sound, and I wondered, you know, how you approach kind of evoking sound and the kind of rhythms of sound and in paint. I suppose that the cross hatching is part of the answer, and color.
Colour. And the movement in the figures. I spent hours and hours doing life drawings.
Right.
You know, I loved it, and I don't go to classes now. I don't go to work from the nude model anymore, but I do love it. And when I paint these pictures, I always think about what the figures are doing. I think about Caribbean people, how Caribbean people move and how they dance, they position themselves in particular situations. Because there's some movements that people culturally take up, I think, especially when they're dancing. And I try to remember those and reproduce them and make sure that the people aren't always facing the spectator, that sometimes they're sideways on, saying that they're spiraling, twisting on themselves, that sort of thing. But in order to do that from your imagination without working from models, it's quite challenging. But because I've done a lot of drawings over the years, I think it makes it possible to do that.
That's so interesting. So how rooted or how important the practice of drawing is for you. That's really interesting. And because that sense of the kind of vibrancy of the crowd and the intimacy of bodies together, you know, that sense of the kind of heat of the crowd, of touch, of bodies in contact is so present, isn't it, in your work? And I was just wondering how you summon that sort of atmosphere of lots of people into the kind of privacy of your studio. And you know, do you listen to music as you're working? Do you you dance as you work?
It's interesting. Music's always been part of my life, but I mean in a major way. From the time I was about 3 years old, I've written about this elsewhere, so I don't want to repeat what people have probably read. But my father, when I was in Barbados, as a young child, 3, 4 years old, my father used to run a choir for the church.
Right.
He could read music, you know, so they were reading all these things. And I sometimes they rehearse in the church building, but on other occasions they rehearse at home, in our home. And as a child, I used to stand at the door with the door ajar, listening to these sounds being sung. And so choral music was my first love. I loved it. I didn't realize how much I loved it until later in my teens. But, you know, listening to hymns being sung, but these hymns are often pieces of music by people like Bach and Handel and Beethoven, Mozart. I mean, they're wonderful pieces of music. And then, of course, at home, we listen to Calypso. In Barbados, we listen to Calypso a lot. And people, you know, playing steel bands and that sort of thing. So you're always immersed in music. And my brothers were into the blues, and then they were into reggae and funk and all that. Music defines us as a family, really. They don't know anything about art. None of them. I'm the maverick one in the family, but they all know or have a passion for music. And so I was brought up in that kind of environment where music was always part of who I am, part of our lives. And one of my brothers is a DJ in Oxford, and a very, very good one too.
That's so fascinating how you brought music into your painting. Really, really, really fascinating. Thank you.
It's always there. It's always there. And when I play, one of the things that I'm in this new studio, as I said earlier, but in my previous studio, we couldn't play music because the walls are very thin. And so music was banned, so you had to wear things. And I miss having music played to air. In my new studio, I can play music to air because it's separate from everyone else's studio space. And it's just incredible. I just immerse myself in it. It's like diving into a pool on a hot day. It's refreshing.
Yeah, and your paintings too are immersive for the viewer, aren't they? You know, we feel like we're diving into this kind of amazing dancing atmosphere, and full of colour and sound.
Well, it's a celebration of the.
Yeah.
You see, we don't. You know, as a child, you're meant to think that we didn't belong, that we didn't make anything, we didn't invent anything. These are things that came at me as a child by teachers and kids. You know, we lived in mud huts. One of my teachers said to me, the one thing we have, because I couldn't challenge teachers, you know, you got a caning, and the boys are constantly saying stupid things. It's a boys' school. But the one thing I had was my respect and love for my people, my family first, and Caribbean people, Caribbean culture. And these paintings are a celebration of who we are, as I see it. And, you know, we've been through all kinds of rubbish, not only in the Caribbean, but throughout the Americas as a result of the slave trade. But we have our dignity, we have our respect, we have our genius. And I try to celebrate those things through the painting.
Yes, there's such a vivid sense of celebration there. That very much speaks to.
It's all about celebrating. They're all about celebrating.
Do you know what's so fascinating in the centre? I don't know if everyone can see, but see the woman with the pink skirt, and then the chap kind of diagonally opposite kind of movement. And I remember this painting was in the show, and I just go and fixate on different parts of the composition and find that exactly what you're saying, Carly, different relationships, different kind of schisms of movement. But also, Paul, what's quite interesting looking at this on the screen and not as a painting is all the kind of negative space and how that kind of works with the kind of abstract bodies, you know, and it's noticeable even in your drawings, these kind of, I don't know if they are deliberate because you are quite automatic, but they are definitely there, you know, the empty spaces.
Yes.
Yeah, they're really alive, those spaces.
It's wonderful of you. Thank you very much.
Well, we're drawing to a close. I should say there are lots of messages of appreciation in the chat box that you can probably see, and you know, thanking you for your presentation, for your sharing your wonderful dialogue, both of you, and for your distinctive form of mark grip making in your drawings. Many messages coming in there. So yes, I just want to thank you both for such a thought-provoking and absorbing conversation, and for sharing so much of your work, Paul. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks everyone listening. Good night, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.